Okay, so with flow control statements, we're going to cover three different kind of basic types. One is the if statement, which we'll do first. We're also going to go over the switch statement as well as loops. And there's a couple different types of loops we'll talk about. Okay, so with if statements, you can do just a basic if, which is a conditional check. If you've used visual scripting like Kismet, there's the compare actions. You can compare different variable types like a bool or an int or a float. That's basically an if statement, and it's in the action that it does there, and then you get to choose the condition from the options. Well, in the case of the if statement here, using the keyword if, you're just going to be defining the condition inside of the parentheses for the if. So for a simple case, if you had a bool variable, say my bool, then this in itself is a complete if statement. Because the value of the bool will determine whether or not it passes through and executes whatever is inside these braces. So since a bool can only have the value of true or false, then either if it's true, it will do something in here, and if it's false, it will skip over and begin executing at the next line after the if statement. You can also add conditional checks here using the comparison operators such as equals. So we could check to see if this bool is equal to true, which would be completely valid. If it's true, then it's true and it goes through. If it's false, then it's false and it goes through. But in the case of a bool variable or even an integer variable, what you're essentially evaluating here is a 0 value is equal to false and a non-zero value is equal to true. So if you had an integer value that was 1 through 100 anything, it would always consider that true if you were just checking, for that int. So if you had my int and it was equal to any non-zero value, so right there, this would always execute as long as this variable was not 0. You won't see, at least in the bool case or in a non-bool case, you won't see this used very often because that's not very intuitive or readable. You want to try to keep in mind that shorter lines of script or code is not always the best way to go because readability is a big part of it. For instance, enumerations that we went over earlier, that's all about kind of adding that readability to your code. So I wouldn't recommend using integers in this example. Bools are a little bit different because they can only have those two values, true or false. So that's kind of intuitive, especially if the variable is clearly named that it's a bool, or if you're using any sort of bool notation. Could be like b underscore something, and so that kind of tells you that it's a bool variable. Hungarian notation, which some people use, although in UnrealScript you may not see it used too often. So in this case, we'll just leave it as my bool. I just wanted to go over kind of the different examples. But then the conditional check is where you would get into if it was going to be an integer. You could say my int is greater than some value, basically greater than 0, which is still that simple true or false. But where the comparison operators is really useful is when you start to add in the else case, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Is you have the if case, you can say if true do this, but then you have the opportunity to catch that in any number of else if statements following that. Actually, before we talk about the else if, let's just go with the else. And this is just a simple binary kind of operation of either or, saying if true, then do something else, do something else. And so this is guaranteed that one of these sections of script, whether it's the true case or the false case, is going to be executed because you just have the either or option. You can then insert, before the else has to go at the very end if you're going to have an else case. You don't have to have an else case too. You can just have an if, and if you don't care to do anything, if it resolves to false, then you just leave the else off and then the script just continues to execute. But if in this case you put in an else if, this allows you to do additional conditional checks, but it will only ever execute one of the if statements in a block of ifs and else ifs. So what I mean by that is if we had multiple else if cases, and there was something happening here because these are else if statements, even if they would evaluate to true, they won't. This code inside of them will not execute if any previous if statement has also resolved to true. So let's set up a better case here for displaying that. So we've got this the my stats up here from our structure example. So we're going to say my stat dot fire. So for this case, say we're this, let's assume we're inside maybe of the apply fire damage function here that we were talking about. Like you've called some function that say I want to trigger an ability. I want to evaluate my stats and maybe use my most powerful stat, or I know that I want to use a fire ability, and so basically I would just want to generate the damage values or the particle effects, or maybe you have like a fire ability that has different stages based on your stat level. There's like the basic, the powerful move, and then like the super uber, I will destroy anything in one shot kind of move, and maybe that's only true if your fire stat is maxed out at 100. So if you just have a couple of simple cases, then what you can do is check here and say, if my stat is less than, my stat fire is less than, if this is less than 25, then we want to do something here. And so we'll say, small fireball. And then we're going to check another case. We're going to say if my stat, we'll say 50. We'll just kind of move up in easy incremental steps here. And we'll do our medium fireball. And then last case that we have here is 75, and this would be the large fireball. Okay, so what we have here is we've come in, so we're inside of the ability, generate ability, or whatever the function is that's testing against the fire stat. We're saying like how big of a fireball are we going to create now that the player has initiated firing an ability. Okay, well, let's find out. So we're going to hit these if statements and check against the stats and say if their stat up here is less than, if this value is less than 25, they just get a small fireball. And maybe this also sets up some damage value based on the actual stat, like a modifier, so you're not getting consistent damage for all values less than 25. 0 to 25 would have increasing damage, but you might just say for the particle effect, we only care about like those large kind of incremental, like, hey, you've essentially leveled up and now you have a bigger fireball from a visual standpoint at least. So in this case, you could say, instead of saying they have to max out 100, you could just say if they're in that top, 25% of their available score, then anything above 75 and is toast. Like you're just going to fire their Uber ability and it's going to destroy whatever it hits or whatever you want. You could also add another if case, else if that was just checking for if it was maxed out at 100. You can basically build as many as you want into here. And the most common case you're going to see is just the if and the else, so you won't see a lot of else ifs in there. There's other ways, such as switch statements, which we're going to talk about here in a second, to handle cases where you want to test against a lot of different ranges of a single variable. So a lot of times you're just going to see this, or even just the if statement by itself with no else. Like I said, you don't have to do processing on once you checked a condition with an if. You don't have to do anything. If it resolves to false and you just don't want to do anything, you don't have to put the else in there, and it will just continue to execute. That's a real quick example. Let me undo here and get this back, and we'll just leave that up, of how you can trigger or chain the else ifs. And then again, if as it comes in and starts evaluating, once it hits the first if case, if this is false, it'll look and see that it has another else if. If that's false, it'll keep going. But if this resolves true, then it would do the script or the code for medium fireball, and then it would skip down to the end of the chain of else's here because it knows that it can only hit one of them. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the if statements and kind of flow control that you can do with that. One last thing that I'll mention here is that if conditions can have more than one condition check per if line or if statement. So if you want to do that, there's two kind of operations you will commonly use, and that is two of the ampersands means and then you also have the straight brace or pipe, which is or. And what that means, and or are two binary operations that you can put into an if check. And so what I can do here is say, maybe I only want to do this line of code if my fire stat is that, but I also want to make sure that my we'll say water is greater than 0. Funny case here, don't know why you would do that. But you're saying, like, I need to know if I have fire less than 25, but I also want to make sure that I don't have 0 in my water stat, or maybe earth would be a better one for this case. So we have, this is saying that this must resolve to true and this must resolve to true. If you change that to be the pipes, then the or means that only one of them needs to be true. If they all are false, this will resolve to false. But if this is true or this is true, then this code will execute. And you can chain, multiples of these. You can have as many as you need to, although, keep in mind readability, and in some cases it might not make as much sense to overload a single if statement with a lot of different conditions. It might make more sense to nest them, which you can do. You can do a case where just basically would take whatever, condition you were adding up here, if it makes more sense. Not saying it always would, but you can also just do this, and you can have a separate set of code that runs in here. So maybe if their earth stat is greater than 0, you want to add like a modifier to the ability. So you could set up something like that. So you can basically say, if my fire stat is less than 25, I know I'm going to fire the small fireball. But I also want to check to see whether, my earth stat has some value meaningful, and I want to apply, modifier or something like that. So you probably will see, a lot of cases like this if you're looking through existing UnrealScript and kind of whether it's reverse engineering or just extending classes that have functionality that you need, but you want to change it for your custom uses. We'll get into all of the class extension here pretty soon, but I just wanted to show, the nesting is fine. You can nest as many as you need, although again, just keep in mind readability of code. So that's another thing you can do. We'll leave that actually there, and then so next we're going to go ahead and talk about the switch statement, which is another flow control statement.